"This neighborhood isn't for everyone," Briggs said, his smirk cold. "People like you don't just walk in and belong." On a quiet afternoon in an affluent neighborhood, a well-dressed black woman walked leisurely down the pristine sidewalk, taking a rare break from her demanding career. She soaked in the peaceful atmosphere, enjoying the crisp air and the sense of accomplishment that came with her hard-earned success. But tranquility was short-lived. A middle-aged police officer, standing at a nearby street corner, caught sight of her and immediately grew suspicious. His sharp gaze followed her every step, his mind jumping to conclusions before he even approached. Unbeknownst to him, the woman he was about to confront wasn't just any resident. She was Eleanor Graves, the newly appointed Director of National Intelligence, a woman whose authority far exceeded his own. This encounter would soon become a lesson that neither the officer nor the entire neighborhood would ever forget. Eleanor stepped out of her newly purchased home, inhaling deeply, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. For years, she had fought tirelessly to reach this moment, standing on the threshold of a life once deemed inaccessible to people like her. At 49, she had shattered barriers, proving that intelligence, resilience, and sheer determination could defy the expectations society had placed upon her. Dressed casually in a simple tracksuit and sneakers, she strolled down the sidewalk, letting herself enjoy the scenery. The neighborhood, lined with stately mansions and meticulously trimmed hedges, exuded wealth and exclusivity. But Eleanor didn't feel out of place. This was her home now. As she crossed an intersection, a watchful pair of eyes locked onto her. Officer Daniel Briggs, a veteran patrol cop with more than 20 years on the force, narrowed his gaze. Something about her casual attire, her confident stride, her skin, made him uneasy. He prided himself on knowing every resident in this area, and she was an unfamiliar face. His instincts told him to intervene. Eleanor noticed him moving toward her, his posture rigid with authority. She wasn't surprised. She had encountered men like him throughout her career, men who saw her presence as an anomaly, a question mark that needed answering. Still, she had only wanted a peaceful walk. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice was firm, carrying the weight of suspicion. "I need to ask you a few questions. What are you doing here?" Eleanor met his gaze evenly, unshaken. "Taking a walk." Her response was simple, her tone calm yet unwavering. Briggs frowned. "A walk? Here? Do you live in this neighborhood?" Eleanor gave a slight nod. "Yes. That house on the corner belongs to me." Briggs turned his head toward the elegant property she gestured to, skepticism etched across his face. "I've been patrolling this area for years. I've never seen you before." His eyes narrowed. "Do you have any proof?" Eleanor took a measured breath, resisting the urge to sigh. "I don't usually carry identification when I go for a stroll. But I assure you, officer, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Briggs let out a faint, humorless chuckle, his stance hardening. "This neighborhood isn't exactly open to just anyone. I make it my job to know who belongs here." His meaning was clear. Eleanor felt a familiar sting, a cut she had endured too many times before. She knew exactly what he was implying. It wasn't about her outfit. It was about her existence, in a space he didn't think she belonged. Still, she refused to waver. Her voice, though measured, carried an unmistakable edge. "Officer, unless there's a law against me walking in my own neighborhood, I suggest you reconsider your assumptions." Briggs's smirk deepened, his tone laced with challenge. "If you have nothing to hide, why not cooperate?" Eleanor's patience, like the fragile calm of the afternoon, was beginning to fray. The tension in Sterling Heights had reached a boiling point. The viral video of Mayor Eleanor Graves standing her ground against Officer Daniel Briggs had ignited a firestorm of debates, protests, and political maneuvering. Within hours, the footage had spread like wildfire across social media, flooding timelines with hashtags like #JusticeForSterling and #MayorStandStrong. By the next morning, news vans were parked outside City Hall, journalists scrambling for a statement. Inside her office, Eleanor sat behind her desk, her phone vibrating nonstop, calls from concerned friends, messages from supporters, and thinly veiled threats from anonymous numbers. Her laptop screen replayed the now infamous video in a continuous loop. Each time she watched, a knot formed in her stomach, but she refused to look away. The door burst open. Carla Whitman, her deputy mayor, strode in, auburn hair pulled into a tight ponytail, a stack of papers clutched in her arms. "Eleanor, we've got a situation." Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, the video is everywhere." "That's not all." Carla placed the papers down. "We've received over 100 emails this morning alone. The phones are ringing nonstop. Half the city is calling you a hero. The other half," she hesitated, "they want your resignation." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I did what I had to do. Those officers were out of line." Carla nodded. "And you are absolutely right. But you've stirred up a hornet's nest. The police union is demanding an apology, and the city council wants an emergency meeting." Eleanor's eyes snapped open. "An apology? For standing up against racial profiling?" Carla's expression darkened. "They're framing it as you undermining law enforcement. It's a mess, Eleanor. And it's only going to get worse." Eleanor's jaw clenched. "Good. Let it get worse. Maybe then people will finally start paying attention." The following days were a whirlwind of protests, town hall meetings, and tense political negotiations. Supporters gathered outside City Hall, waving signs that read "Accountability Now" and "Justice for All." Opponents weren't far behind, chanting "Back the Blue" and demanding her removal from office. Eleanor faced it all with unwavering determination. She met with community leaders, pushed for police reform, and refused to be silenced. But the backlash was growing fiercer. One evening, as she prepared for another live interview, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Watch your back, Mayor. You've made powerful enemies." Eleanor stared at the screen, a cold chill running down her spine. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't afford to stop now. The fight for justice in Sterling Heights had only just begun. The storm in Sterling Heights was far from over. The police union had doubled down, framing Officer Daniel Briggs and his partner Officer Carlson as victims of an unjust political attack. Their families flooded the media with emotional interviews, painting the officers as honorable men wrongfully vilified. In her office, Mayor Eleanor Graves read the headlines, her jaw tightening. "Let them try," she said, placing her phone down. "We have the truth on our side." Carla Whitman, her deputy mayor, crossed her arms. "The truth doesn't always win in politics, Eleanor. You need to be prepared for a fight." And that fight was about to begin. The emergency city council meeting. That evening, the city council chamber was packed. News crews lined the walls, their cameras focused on the raised dais. Outside, protesters filled the streets, some demanding accountability, others accusing Eleanor of creating division. At the center of it all sat Council President Walter Harrington, an older man with a carefully measured expression. He struck his gavel, calling the session to order. "We are here to address the unrest that has gripped our city in recent days," Harrington began, his voice heavy. "Mayor Graves, your actions have been called into question. This council seeks to understand their impact on Sterling Heights." Eleanor stood, dressed in a sleek navy suit. She projected confidence, though the weight of the moment pressed down on her. "I understand the gravity of this situation, Councilman Harrington," she said, her voice unwavering. "But let's be clear, the unrest in our city did not begin with my actions. It began with decades of unchecked bias and systemic failures that have left our communities divided and distrustful." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others crossed their arms, unimpressed. Harrington raised a hand for silence. "Mayor Graves, while we acknowledge the need for reform, your confrontation with Officers Briggs and Carlson has escalated tensions. The police union claims your actions undermine their authority." Eleanor's lips pressed into a firm line. "Undermine their authority?" she repeated. "What authority allows profiling and harassment to go unchecked? What authority protects officers at the expense of the people they are sworn to serve? If standing against that is seen as undermining, then I'll wear it as a badge of honor." Applause erupted from her supporters. The gavel struck hard. Harrington's expression darkened. Mayor Graves, this council must consider the broader implications of your actions. Eleanor swept her gaze across the chamber. The broader implications are this. Sterling Heights has a chance to lead. We can continue down a path of complacency, or we can be the city that says enough to injustice. The choice is yours. The verdict and a warning. The deliberations stretched into the early morning hours. Outside, the city remained divided. Supporters chanting for justice, opponents accusing Eleanor of sowing chaos. Inside, Eleanor stood her ground. She fielded pointed questions, rebutted accusations, and laid out her vision for a more just Sterling Heights. As dawn broke, Walter Harrington finally spoke. After thorough discussion, this council acknowledges the need for reforms in our law enforcement practices. However, we urge Mayor Graves to work collaboratively with the police department to ensure unity in our city. It wasn't a full victory, but it wasn't a loss either. Eleanor nodded. I look forward to working with this council and our community to bring about meaningful change. Her voice was steady, but inside, she knew the fight was far from over. That night, as she prepared to leave City Hall, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You've made powerful enemies. Watch your back. Eleanor stared at the message, her pulse quickening. She took a deep breath. She had known from the beginning, this battle wasn't just political. It was personal, and the real war was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, Mayor Eleanor Jameson led the charge in transforming Fairhaven's police department. She implemented sweeping reforms, including the creation of a civilian oversight board, mandatory bias training, and new community engagement initiatives. The resistance was fierce. Police unions pushed back. Some officers resigned in protest, and political adversaries tried to discredit her. But Ellie, unwavering in her mission, pressed forward. One crisp afternoon, as she walked through downtown Fairhaven, she heard a familiar voice behind her. Mayor Jameson? Turning, she saw Marcus, the young man from the parking lot, the one whose unjust confrontation had sparked the city's reckoning. His eyes held gratitude and something deeper, purpose. I just wanted to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to stand up for me that night, but you did. And because of that, so many of us feel seen for the first time. Ellie studied him for a moment before placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Marcus, this isn't just my fight, it's ours, she said firmly. Keep using your voice. Keep pushing forward. Together, we'll make sure Fairhaven lives up to its promise. Marcus nodded, his determination matching hers. The city's transformation was slow, but real. The protests had evolved into meaningful dialogues. The citizens of Fairhaven, black, white, rich, poor, had begun to truly talk to one another, to listen, to understand. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. Ellie knew the road ahead would still be long, still fraught with challenges, but she also knew this. She wasn't walking it alone.